There we go. All right, we are recording live Saturday, August 6, 2022, 9:30 a.m. from Kirkland, Washington. This is John and Jody Griffin. And then we have my dad here from Portland, Oregon and Boring, Oregon. Also John. And then my brother-in-law out of Boring, Oregon, Lee Meadowcroft. And we've done Sabbath school before, so some of you may remember us. Hopefully it's a good memory. And it's actually fairly pleasant here in Kirkland. Blue skies and cool weather, but it's going to be hot today. They're going to be they're having seafair all weekend. So we've got blue angels flying over here and there, usually around 3 p.m. So it's supposed to be hot in Boring area as well. Today we're going to be discussing chapter 29 from Prophets and Kings. Chapter 29 is the ambassadors from Babylon. And so I'm going to do a fairly quick summary, and then we'll get some first impressions and then maybe do a couple deep dives. Initially, this chapter wasn't as exciting as I was hoping. It's kind of the end of Hezekiah's life. And honestly, one of those episodes in someone's life where they just kind of failed fairly completely and fairly obviously. But doing a little bit of a deeper dive on it, it actually does bring out a lot of interesting points. So a quick summary. Like I said, King Hezekiah was the 13th king of Judah. Did a little bit of research, and sorry for getting a little bit of background noise with traffic behind us. 13th king of Hezekiah, and actually he was one of the good kings of Judah, was able to turn the country around very significantly to the point where he was probably one of the greatest kings of Judah since David, and that's mentioned a couple times, with a lot of reform, and God blessed him appropriately. This chapter starts right after, I'm trying to get the guy's name, right after the Assyrians come to take Judah, and specifically Jerusalem, and this angel of the Lord came and killed 185,000 of the Assyrians, which obviously got rid of the Assyrians, at least for the time being. But then inexplicably, Hezekiah becomes sick with what they describe as a fatal malady. So obviously very sick. And he prays to God. And actually Isaiah comes and tells him that he is going to die of this sickness. And this is when he prays to God and cries, and God hears his cries and his prayer and sends Isaiah back to basically tell him he's got another 15 years to live. And this obviously is a life-changing moment for Hezekiah. And God, through Isaiah, gives Hezekiah a sign that this will happen in 3 days. And that sign is to move the sun back 10 degrees. And this happens, and Hezekiah gets better. But far off, in another land that's overshadowed by the Assyrians, a land called Babylon, which ironically enough is probably where Abraham originally came from. But this country, Babylon, has wise men that are keeping an eye on things, and they notice this phenomenon that the sun moves back 10 degrees. And they start figuring out what's going on, and their king finally finds out that King Hezekiah was healed by God, and that's why the sun went back 10 degrees. And he sends envoys to Hezekiah to, congratulate him on getting well, but also to find out what's going on. And apparently this was a chance for Hezekiah to talk to them about God, but then Hezekiah kind of gets off track and instead shows him all of the wealth of Judah that he has accomplished in his lifetime, inexplicably leaving God out. And obviously God is not happy about this. And again, Hezekiah shows up and he finds out, and I wasn't able to find out for sure if this was the first hint that Israel and Judah would be going to Babylon. But basically Hezekiah tells them that this envoy of people represented a people that would eventually have all the wealth of Judah and Israel, and then ultimately have the Israelites captives in Judah as well. So I titled this Sabbath School, Second Chances and Piercing Failures. And I'm going to leave it there. There's a couple areas I want to talk about because I did do a little bit of research, which I thought was interesting. So does anyone have some first thoughts, and then we'll kind of go from there?
Well, the first thing that I thought of in reading, well, I also read the in 2 Kings chapter 20 is where the story is. The thing Ellen White doesn't bring out too much is he seems fairly self-centered. At the end of the story, after he basically falls flat, with the visitors from Babylon, Isaiah comes back and says, hey, your sons are gonna be taken as slaves, and the Babylonians are gonna come and take over all of this wealth that you showed them. And his response was like, well, that's okay. During my lifetime, there will be peace. And it just seemed like a very, very, for somebody who's, God-fearing, and it's one of those things where Ellen White brings him out as a very positive figure. That's a really strange response to me. Like, well, as long as it's okay for me, I'm good. I don't care what happens after I die. So anyway, I know that's kind of a negative first impression, but that's kind of what hit me first. So
yeah, it's something that kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth after this whole story. I mean, he obviously failed, and he is, has to come to grips with the fact that he failed. But then he finds out, that, well, and then he basically ends by saying, that, well, this won't happen in my lifetime. And I agree, it kind of sounds self-centered. There might be one or two other things that shed a little light on that. So this story, real quick, before we go to others, is found in 2 Kings 20. But ironically enough, it's also found in 2 Chronicles. Oh, where did it go? It's also found in 2 Chronicles. I just looked it up. Yeah, right here. 32. It's kind of near the end of that chapter. And then it is also found in Isaiah 38. And it's almost word for word in the Kings, 2 Kings and Isaiah. The 2 Chronicles is a little bit of a variation on it, but they all basically tell the same story. And when I did a little bit of research, they talked about Hezekiah being an interesting king in that we have these 3 different places in the Bible where they talk about this story and about him. But there's also from the Assyrian records, as well as several other records, pagan records during that time period, references to Hezekiah. The interesting thing is the Assyrian records do not talk about the 187,000 people, 185,000 soldiers being killed, but they do talk about Hezekiah and how he was one of the ones that refused to kind of do what I think it was Sennacherib wanted him to do, as far as obeying him and giving him taxes and stuff. The other thing that was interesting, and then we'll move to either Dad or Jody on first thoughts, is that it's referenced in the Talmud that, and that's one of the Jewish holy books besides the Old Testament, Pentateuch, I guess. But the Talmud talks about why Hezekiah might have become sick. And what they say is that Hezekiah and Isaiah were not on speaking terms. And Isaiah and Micah were kind of the two main prophets during Hezekiah's reign. But apparently Hezekiah and Isaiah were not on speaking terms. And we don't know exactly why, but it may have to do with some of this self-centeredness. You have a guy that's reforming the country. It is a little ironic that he's not seeing eye to eye with at least, one of the well-known prophets of the time. But God gives Hezekiah this illness to force Isaiah to come and tell Hezekiah that he's going to die. And then Hezekiah says his prayer, and he's crying while he's praying. And it forces Hezekiah to come back to tell him that he will now live. The irony in what comes from the Talmud that I thought was interesting was that Hezekiah is thought to not have any heirs at the time. And I don't know if this plays into the self-centeredness or not, but this change in Hezekiah's life is what, according to the Talmud again, caused him to get married and ultimately have children, of which Manasseh was his heir, who took the throne at 12 years old, which means it wasn't until 3 years after Hezekiah started his 15 years that Manasseh was born. And then to just add a little grit to the whole thing, it appears that Hezekiah's wife was a high priest's daughter, and some people say possibly even one of Isaiah's daughters. So there might have been a little bit of a rift between the monarchy and the religious leaders of the day. And some of it might have been this self-centeredness, which then brings me back to what Lee was talking about to some degree, that, Hezekiah's children would eventually become captives in Babylon. Some of them would even become eunuchs. And this may have even been some of Isaiah's grandchildren, if any of that Talmud story was even partially true. Anyway, it was too good not to mention. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but Lee was talking about the self-centeredness of Isaiah, and it's like, okay, I don't die of this fatal malady. I have 15 more years to live. He gets into trouble. He knows that they're going to become captive, but he says, oh, well, at least it's not going to happen in my lifetime. Save it for later. Other people will have to deal with it. All right, Dad, Jody, any first thoughts on this? They don't have to be related to what we've just been talking about.
Well, I was impressed that in all three places where you find this story, that it appears written in such a fashion that God changes his mind, or at least changes his direction about what his plan is to go, based on the prayer of Hezekiah. And it's just kind of fascinating to me that it points out that God is a compassionate person. He really cares about what Hezekiah felt and what people feel, and that he listens, that he hears what we say, and he's on top of it all the time. And I was just impressed as I was reading this. I can remember I had an experience something like this December of 1971 when John, the guy sitting here, was dying, and I was praying that he would live. And the sun didn't move back, but at least I still have a son, which I'm incredibly thankful for. And it just points out that this is not an isolated thing. I think that in many people's lives, there are experiences where there have been interventions of various kinds that have really changed the direction of their life. and in some cases in a positive fashion. In this case, it appears it was not all a positive direction.
Well, and I'm going to turn this around on you, Dad. I mean, I forget when it was, but you had your own sickness and you thought you were going to die. And there was a lot of prayer, and you're still here with us. So, and so, yeah, that is one of the points I wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive on. So I think now's as good a time as any to mention it. It's and I totally agree that God hears prayers and answers prayers, but it's clear that there's different types of prayers. And this prayer of Hezekiah is very simple. It sounds like it's in his bed where he's kind of on his deathbed. And he says to God, "Remember, O Lord, how I have walked before you faithfully and with wholehearted devotion and have done what is good in your eyes." And then he wept. That's in stark contrast to the previous chapter when Sennacherib and the Assyrians are surrounding Jerusalem. And again, he gets some envoys from the Assyrians this time, basically making fun of them and telling them they aren't going to live, they aren't going to make it, everyone else's gods had failed, why would their gods succeed in overcoming the Assyrians? And he gets this letter and he takes it to the temple and he lays it out, and he has this very, very matter-of-fact prayer with God, where he basically says, "It is true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste with these nations and their lands." And he kind of talks about the situation. And once again, God, either makes a point or changes his mind and decides, well, I want to keep it, Judah and Jerusalem up and going for my good. So, I mean, and then this is in stark contrast to the temple system, which was a system set up for prayer and forgiveness of sins. So, I mean, let's talk about prayer. Is there a right way to pray? Is there a wrong way to pray? Does prayer change with circumstances? I mean, I think we can all agree that God hears prayers. I'm not sure he always answers them the way we want.
Well, I was thinking along that same line, John. And I was thinking that, a lot of prayers are almost routine. Would you bless the food, or thankful for the food, or God, would you be with us during this church board meeting, or these kind of prayers. Would you help me sleep well tonight, or may I have health? There's lots of these kind of prayers that are not really very specific. And I frequently think about the text where it says, "I would have given you more if you would have asked for more." Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering whether if we were more specific about exactly what it is that we need, we might get more from this. I think in when I go to board meetings, at church board meetings, and really many meetings, we say, "Hey, please be with us during this." Well, God has already told us he's with us 100% of the time, no matter what. So, okay, what does that prayer really do?
It might be a formality, because you have to start a church board meeting off with prayer. So it might just be formality.
I think, John, that those kinds of prayers, you're acknowledging that connection. I think it's not bless this food, be with us during this meeting. I mean, I think yes, he is going to be there. But I think sometimes there's value in just verbally acknowledging that you're, hopefully trying to rely on God, and hopefully that he's there. I mean, you're just expressing that in a public way, I guess. That's my only answer to that.
Yeah, but I think the other thing, sometimes one problem I guess I have with some routine prayers, they're usually all about us.
Yeah.
We're not really praying for anybody else necessarily. It's just praying for ourselves and our own like immediate circumstances or needs or whatever. So sometimes I think like when there's, intercessory prayer, when we're praying for someone, then that seems like a little bit more meaningful than when we just, are praying for ourselves to sleep well and have a good day kind of thing.
And I think some people pray better than others. There's just no other way of saying that.
Yeah, but how
And
can
I
you
agree with what
compare
Jody
prayers?
is saying. A lot of prayers are just self-centered prayers. And Jody's already saying how can you compare prayers? But I think you can in public. Some people do pray better than others. But I don't think those prayers are necessarily heard better by God or answered more, at least in the way we want by God. And so prayer is something I actually struggle with to some degree. I mean, I agree with Dad. I mean, there's kind of these formality types of prayers. And I agree with Lee. It's acknowledging a higher power. And I think that's important because I think if you don't acknowledge a higher power, it's easy to forget about the higher power that does give us our sleep, that does give us our food, that does give us our health. And then it's too easy to take credit for that, where credit really does belong to God. And so prayer for me has been very, honestly, very difficult and somewhat of a process and something I've done some research on. And I know what I'm doing recently, which is, you can laugh if you want, but I start my week with a 3x5 card, and I use an acronym that I learned reading a book about prayer. And the acronym is prayer, P-R-A-Y. And the P stands for praise, where you give God praise and acknowledge who he is and what he's done for you. The R is repentance, where you acknowledge who you are and that you are a sinner living in a world of sin. And the A is kind of your ask. And I found, for me, the A is actually probably the most important, because that's where I will ask God and try to be specific about things that are concerning me at the time. But that's also where I will take note of things that are happening with, family and friends and in our communities that I think are important to know about, and then to remember and to approach God in prayer. And I'll write those down, and as they get answered, I'll tend to cross them off, and or if they become irrelevant after a while, just let them drop off the list. The yes, the Y part of the acronym, just to complete this, is for yes, kind of with an exclamation point. Acknowledging that God does hear prayers and God is able to answer prayers, while at the same time knowing that he doesn't always answer them the way we want. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. But if you keep track of these things, it's interesting. God usually answers the prayer better than you would answer it often. But I don't do this every day. I try to start my week with this. And then as the week goes on, I'll pull it out every morning, and it helps me remember the stuff I need to remember in prayer, but it also gives me a chance to realize that some prayers are getting answered, and then to add other prayers that I might have as the week goes on. This is kind of in the spirit of mindfulness. I've never been able to journal very well. And I think one of my brothers, Cragen, does a remarkable amount of journaling. And I think it slows you down. It makes you think, and it gives you a little bit better process, at least for me. Interestingly, going back to Hezekiah, he does write down this prayer afterward, and that's what's in Isaiah. And it's Isaiah 38, and it goes from verse 10 all the way to verse 22. and it's almost a psalm, honestly. It's kind of in that poetic style where he's acknowledging what God's done. He is stating that God has answered his prayer. And then in the middle of it, and this is also on page 343 in Prophets and Kings chapter. In the middle of it, it says, "What shall I say?" And then he talks about how this has changed God's life, how this has changed his life, and how he wants to follow God better and do a better job than he even already has done. And that's, in there for our record. And I think that is another important part of prayer, is looping back and being thankful, and then maybe putting it in writing so that you have it for later, or others potentially have it for later. Those are just some of my thoughts on prayer. And I'm looking at Jody because she's the next one to say what was important in this chapter.
Like if it was my clue. So when I first read the story, it was, I guess, taking a very simplistic view of the whole thing. You read the story and he starts out, he's gravely ill, and then like he prays, and miraculously he gets this message that he's got an extra 15 years, which, I mean, that's like rather specific. I guess, do you count down those years when you start them, or how do you do that? I don't know. It seems a little dicey there for me. But so he gets this time that he's granted, like this grace and a second chance, and so you're like on his side. And then I felt like he kind of blew it. I felt like he was I deal with mid-teen age group in my professional life, and I felt like he was like being stupid and showing somebody something really expensive they got, and then it disappearing like later on. And so I was like, he has a second chance, and then he does something really stupid. And so then I wasn't cheering for him quite as much as I was at the beginning, where I was like, oh yeah, look at this. So I feel like he got a second chance, and I don't know, when you have a second chance, how do you use that wisely, I guess? Because, we know of people who are ill or who are, I guess, on borrowed time. I guess we're all on borrowed time. We don't know when the end is. We don't know 15 years. We don't have a countdown like that, but I just feel like he wasn't wise in his use to make good of the time he was given. I mean, yeah, okay. So he, had this family and other things. Yeah, he did other things, but I'm like,
Yeah, that is very interesting. I mean, on one hand, I think it'd be really great. You have this amount of time. I mean, wow, I know exactly. It's like, I can really focus on these 15 years. And just, yeah, like he was given a very specific time of what you have left. And then he just sort of backslid. I mean, it seems to me like, wow, that could really hone my focus. I mean, 15 years would make me 68, so maybe I could go with a little bit more, but still be nice.
I don't know. I mean, you look at that and you're like, if you did have a specific amount of time, which, I mean, some people are given a prognosis and they have like, they kind of have an idea, but it's very specific. And I don't know, would you plan it out? Like, oh, from
The
year
5, 10.
Yeah, the 5, 10, 15 year plan. Like, how would you devise your time? But then, I mean, when you think about that, you're like, okay, 15 years. And, you think about that, and do you have a plan? I don't know. Do we plan? I don't think we do. I was, when I drive by myself, I usually call a friend and catch up. And my last trip back from Portland, I was chatting with a friend who lost her husband about a year ago, and she was like, well, you can make all the plans in the world you want to, but they're not going to turn out the way you think they are. And I was like, wow, thanks for that. But I mean, I get it from her perspective, but yet I was, and her husband did kind of have a second chance and with the cancer that he had. But yet I was like, like, because I was saying, she was asking something about retirement. I was like, well, we kind of have, some things in mind. And basically she told me good luck. So, okay. So I'm not sure you would do the 5, the 10, I'm doing this trip and this in year 7 and year 9. And, I don't know.
Dad, you're on mute.
I was thinking that that if he would have died at that time, Manasseh would never have been born. And so that terrible dive that they took during Manasseh's reign would not have happened. And the ambassadors to Babylon would never have found out about the gold that Israel had. And so looking at it now, should God have said, the 15 years that you're going to get does not really, or maybe God didn't know with that kind of certainty what would happen if Hezekiah was given more life.
Yeah, I was looking up. I couldn't remember for sure when Hezekiah died, but he died at age 54. So he was technically sick at age 39, which was fairly young, but people didn't live as long then. And then, yeah, very much. Manasseh was 12 years old when he took over reign of Judah, and Manasseh wouldn't have happened. So it is interesting. Does anyone have any other thoughts on that? Because then I think, go ahead, Lee, if you had a thought.
No, I don't have, not on that particular. I had another thought about why he asked for a sign, but that's a different topic.
Well, that's a different topic. And I do want to talk about that because I think that's interesting. So so we titled this Second Chances and Piercing Failures. I think it's interesting that these circumstances happen. And Dad, you're talking about how the envoys from Babylon wouldn't have had a chance to see all the wealth of Judah, which might have been surprising because Judah wasn't huge, and even Judah and Israel combined weren't huge. But apparently they had a lot of wealth. But I don't think that's what God had in mind. And that's where this Chronicles variation of the story is interesting, because it basically says that God tested him by sending these envoys and then kind of stepping back to see what Hezekiah would do. And Hezekiah has had this sickness. He's been given a new lease on life with another 15 years. And we don't know exactly when these envoys showed up, but presumably this, 10 degrees of the sun moving back kind of cued people in Babylon as to something going on. And so however long it took them to figure out where this came from is how long it took these envoys to show up. But it's very clear, and on page 344 in Prophets and Kings, Ellen White says, and it's the very last sentence going on to the next page, it says, "But pride and vanity took possession of Hezekiah's heart, and in self-exaltation he laid open to covetous eyes the treasures with which God had enriched the people." And that's not what God wanted. If you look, where was it?
Yeah, it appears clear that what Hezekiah did at least had some impact on what happened later.
Yeah, and then on page 345, he says, not to glor, or she says, Ellen White says, not to glorify God did he do this, but to exalt himself in the eyes of the foreign princes. So in a lot of ways, it's this self-exaltation and pride and vanity that kind of took hold of Hezekiah. And this meeting happened, and I think it was arranged by God, and I think it was a test. And that's what on page 346 of Prophets and Kings, it says that it was a test of Hezekiah's gratitude and devotion to God. But Hezekiah got distracted and failed the test. And Ellen White talks about this being a very easy opportunity for Hezekiah to witness to these envoys, witness to them about what God has done to them, which then ultimately leads to, well, who is this God? And is an opportunity for Hezekiah to tell the Babylonians who the God of Israel is and what the God of Israel has done for all of Israel, and then specifically for him. And so I think what this leads to is that we are ultimately given opportunities to do this ourselves, not maybe necessarily in such a big way. Although I think, Dad, with your sickness, it gave you an opportunity and you took hold of that. And it was an opportunity to tell people, yes, I was sick and I thought I was going to die, but God was good and he has healed me. And it's like, well, that gives an explanation for why you're still around, but it also is a segue into, well, who is this God? And ultimately it's an opportunity to say, well, this is a God of love. That's our creator God. That's our savior God. This is the same God that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, worship. This is the same God that brought the Israelites out of Egypt with Moses and set up, David and Solomon and all these kings, and then ultimately sent us his son to save us from our sins. And I think unless you're kind of cued into these opportunities, you can miss these opportunities. She on page 347 says, far more than we do, we need to speak, and this is the last paragraph, we need to speak of the precious chapters in our experience of the mercy and loving kindness of God and of the matchless depths of the Savior's love. And this is in our day-to-day interactions is what she's talking about with others. Sorry, I started getting a little preachy at the end there.
No, I think that was well put, very well put. It seems like if we are thinking along these terms of how we can enforce these opportunities, how we can use them to guide. I mean, certainly it appears that if Babylon would have known more about God, like they learned about with Nebuchadnezzar, one generation later, things might have been quite different.
Yeah. And that's the other quote I had circled here. It was on page 346, kind of in the middle. It said, had Hezekiah improved the opportunity given him to bear witness to the power, the goodness, the compassion of the God of Israel, the report of the ambassadors would have been a light piercing darkness. And I think we all are potentially light to darkness in this world. And God knows there's plenty of darkness in this world. And a little light can go a long ways. And I think this is an opportunity missed by Hezekiah. And I think that's why God was so unhappy with how this turned out.
I feel like she comes down a little heavy at the end.
Yes.
I was like, whoa, okay. Like you're responsible for a lot of things for other people. The last part of the chapter just felt like, she came down like, your influence and what you do in your actions and your words are of utmost importance. anyways, yeah, that's my impression of the last part. I was like, whoa, okay then.
Yeah, I mean, it was down to like one reckless movement. One, it's like, wow, that's a high standard.
Yeah.
I'm out.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't think you're judged by one reckless movement, but I think one reckless movement at the wrong time in someone's life what she was getting at may go a lot deeper than we, would realize, and so I think her admonition is to be thoughtful in your interactions and be careful when you're being thoughtless,
Yeah,
because
but
that can lead you to trouble.
I know, but there's sometimes like you think you don't even realize what you say and the impact it has on people, because you can think or people will tell you, oh, well, so and so, one time they said this to me. And it's like, well, I wonder if that person who said it even remembers what they said. But it made a huge impact on somebody, whether it's for the good or for the negative. And you think out of the hundreds and thousands of people that you deal with over your lifetime, you're like, well, shoot, maybe a couple hundred people have some bad thing that they think of, like you said, and you didn't even realize it, kind of a thing. I don't know.
Well, then that brings me, go ahead, Dad.
Well, I was just going to say, though, that in my life, there have been many times, particularly with teachers, that have just thrown off, this is what I would do without a lot of thought, that have had a huge impact on what I do. I can think about my 8th grade teacher. He said, after he was explaining math, which I thought was a total mystery, he said, you can do this. And, that was not something he thought through for a long time. It was just, on my life, that was the first time that I can remember particular affirmation of that, of math. I'm thinking, he thinks I could do this. And I would say that, at least in my life, and it was Ernest Schock that said it, who later became, a superintendent. But in any event, that little kind of statement had quite an impact on my life.
Yeah, that's interesting, because really my first job going into high school was a summer getting ready for camp meeting in Gladstone, Oregon. And it was with some of the other high school kids, and I was either freshman or sophomore. And so there were obviously juniors and seniors there. And there weren't a lot of us. There was maybe half a dozen or so. But like any other group of kids, there was a lot of goofing around going on and a lot of getting out of work. And I previously worked very hard and been encouraged to by my parents. And so we kind of had this work ethic. And I did my best to work hard, but it was kind of this conflict where there were people that were doing their best to not work hard. There was also this peer pressure to be part of this group that I knew I was going to be in high school with and have to interact with. But apparently, at least some of the work I did not go unrecognized, because I do remember we had to go pick up stuff in this truck, and the guy in charge was this older guy. I could imagine he's a conference worker, maybe a pastor. I don't think he was a pastor though, but probably a conference worker. And at one point we were both in the truck together. And he said, John, I noticed that you're a hard worker. And he says, I think you can go a long way in your life if you're just honest and hardworking. He said, there's a lot you can learn in school and a lot you can do from school, but you can always be very successful in whatever you do as long as you're honest and hardworking. And it was just a moment in time. I don't even remember this guy's name. I don't remember a lot else about the summer, but I do remember him saying that and recognizing that there were eyes on us while we were, doing stuff that we didn't think people were watching necessarily, and that it sounded like good advice and good wisdom. And it's something I've remembered, and it was again just a comment in passing, probably in his mind, but it did make a difference for me. All right, Lee. The sun
Yeah.
moving back 10 degrees. What does that mean?
Well, it's just really weird because Isaiah comes to him and says, God told me you're gonna die. He believes him 100%, goes into a fit, is crying. And then when Isaiah comes back, says, well, God changed his mind. You're going to be fine. You got 15 years. Then he's like, well, what sign do I get? It's like, how about that? How about Isaiah came back and talked to you? That's right there. And I just thought that was very strange. It's like, I mean, I tend to focus on negative maybe more than others, and maybe that was him. It's like, well, if it was negative, he just believed it like that. If it was positive, he's like, well, I'm not sure I trust that message. And that just struck me as very odd. I don't have an answer. I found it really, really weird.
So it made me think of two stories. One was Gideon, who kind of screwed it up. I mean, Hezekiah, it would have been the equivalent of Gideon if Hezekiah had said, well, yeah, have the sun go forward 10 degrees and then call Isaiah back and say, well, I screwed up. The sun always goes forward. What's the big deal if it goes forward 10 degrees? Let's have it go backwards 10 degrees. And, it's really kind of a test. It's not a test of God. It's a test to our faith and willing to accept things. Because then the other story I think about is, John the Baptist's parents. His dad's in the temple, the Day of Atonement, and an angel comes and tells him this stuff. And he's old and his wife's barren. And he says, how can this be? And the angel's like, well, if you aren't going to have enough faith to just take me at my word, I'm going to strike you dumb for 9 months. And so, I mean, when do you ask for a sign? When don't you ask for a sign? I mean, I guess ultimately you don't ask for a sign, you just have faith and move on. But someone explain this to me.
I think people ask for signs. They're like, oh, I don't know, just people ask for random signs. Oh, let me run into somebody who says such and such, or I don't know. But I mean, these seem like pretty big. Moving the sun is kind of a big sign. It's not just like, for somebody to say my hair looks nice today and I'll stick with this style. I mean, it's like, it's not that. It's like, that's pretty remarkable.
Well, there is a precedence for that too, wasn't it? Who was it? The one after Moses. I have Gideon stuck in my head, but it was Joshua. Joshua is fighting these people and he needs more time. And so God stops time, for almost the better part of a day so that the Israelites can finish defeating their enemies. But this is not just stopping time, it's backing up time. And so you guys know me enough by now. I did a little bit of research, what's 10 degrees of the sun in minutes or hours now? Does anyone know? Turns out it's 40 minutes roughly. And so, and then the question is, did time go backwards or just did the sun go backwards? And there was actually some commentary online about this. And this is irrelevant to the whole story, I'll just say. Although it is what clued the Babylonians in to kind of give you the other half of the story. But the thought was that the God is all powerful, and so he can control all of these things, including the sun going backwards and time going backwards. But the conclusion, if there is such a thing, was that God probably moved the sun back 10 degrees, but the time kept going forward, and that the next morning started out at roughly the same time it had always started, and days went on ever since. It's interesting. We do serve an awesome God that is in control. And I mean, the commentary was interesting because it's like, well, if time, how does that work? Does because it's the Earth rotating around the sun ultimately in a year, but it's the Earth rotating on its axis that gives us day and night, right? And so if the sun goes backwards, theoretically the Earth has to stop rotating. And if the Earth stops rotating, you lose the gravitational field, and it can create all kinds of problems. So if you wanted the science behind why they thought the sun just kind of went backwards, that's kind of what I took.
Well, the place where I came at this was just like you got through saying, is that in fact it isn't the sun that moved backwards, it was the Earth. But then time now, and where I'm puzzled is time actually, by changing the velocity in relation to things, which is, we may not sense that, will then change time. And changing the gravity during that time would also change time, because time is affected by gravity. But spending a lot of time in that still leaves me with a huge number of questions about how this happened. And I could blow it off to begin with by saying, well, maybe that was just a local phenomena. But if the same thing was happening in Babylon and possibly in other parts of the earth, that kind of blew that theory out of this. So I can tell you I've given a lot of thought to it, but it has not been very fruitful at all.
Well, yeah, and that's what I mean. It's not the point of this story. But we got about 5-10 minutes. There is one other deep dive that I think we should do that I think does add to the point of this story, at least indirectly, if not directly. And I mentioned earlier on that Hezekiah was an instrument of reform for Israel, and compared to what most would consider Israel's greatest king, David. It's hard not to look at King David, and this is again in the spirit of second chances and piercing failures, which is a play on that light piercing darkness, obviously the opposite of that when it's failures. But King David had a piercing failure in his reign that does show up, I think, in Kings and Chronicles. I have to double check that. But that had to do with Bathsheba and him getting lax in his love of God and his following God to the point where he let lust kind of take over in his life, that led to murder and a massive cover-up that, again, the prophet of his time brought to his attention, and led to his reform, at least, and ultimately words written down that we can learn from. And so you have these two great kings, David and his failure, and Hezekiah and his failure. What defines a person is my question. Are we defined by our successes? Are we defined by our failures? Are we defined by our responses to either successes or failures? I want to throw that out and see what your thoughts are, and then we'll wrap things up.
I think a combination of all of the above, because when you look at, say, like presidents, which, basically leaders like kings that we're reading about, like, what were their successes? What were their failures? Like they usually give them both, unless you don't like the person, then you just talk about their failures. But I think it's a combination of experiences.
Yeah, I think I'd like the answer to be the responses to our failures and the responses to our achievements, because I think Jody hit on the nail on the head there when she said, yeah, if I don't like this person, I'm going to focus on everything that they've done wrong. And that's my definition of that person. And I think that's unfortunate. When you can learn, these stories of David and Hezekiah, you see faith doing this, right? And I think that's in all of us. And if we're defined only by when we fail, it's totally ignoring, the flip side of that coin. And the same thing is, there's some great people who have achieved a lot, and just kind of shove all their failures in the backside. I think how we grow and how we learn from the things that we've done wrong, that should be the definition of who we are, more than, you know, the few times that we fail or the few times that we achieve. I mean, that's my hope, I guess.
Dad, any thoughts?
Well, I would say I thought Lee did a splendid job of summing that up. From my perspective, I think that was very good. And I think that, you know, there's certainly some people that have not been in a position to make monumental decisions of, you know, a variety of different things. And there are some people, well, like you, John, that are in surgery, you're constantly making decisions about every move. And in those circumstances, it can either be spectacular or disaster, you know. And so it seems like to me that it is, given the opportunities you have and the freedom that you have under those circumstances, because many times we don't have much freedom about how we respond, but it's our responses that really make a decision, that tell us about that person.
Yeah, I think the word we like to use as surgeons is spectacular, whether it has to do with success or failure. We all have spectacular successes. We all have spectacular failures. And you're right. It's one move after another. And it's actually a good analogy, because it's small incremental moves during a surgery that lead to what you're trying to accomplish overall. But I think every life is that. And there's some things you have control of, I think, is the caveat to this whole thing. And obviously with David and Hezekiah, they did have control of their two biggest failures, potentially. They just kind of got sloppy and sidetracked. And I think we all, whether we're in a position of leadership, I mean, Jody was talking about presidents being our version of kings. And obviously the Bible's talking about kings and leaders in a lot of ways, more than just your everyday people. But I think most of us can define ourselves as everyday people, and everyday people do have some control over their successes and some control over their failures. But ultimately, I think it's the trajectory and keeping God close that can lead you to respond appropriately to those and grow, like Lee was saying. And I think more than anything, that's what God wants us to grow in our faith with Him and our love and relationship with Him, that leads to our lives being a light that pierces the darkness in the world that we live in. So I want to close with prayer. I think we have a minute or two. I do want to mention that we will be having church service at 11:15 that follows today, and that we are going through this book, Prophets and Kings, which I've actually tried to stay caught up with. I'd encourage you to do that. It's a good commentary on the Bible. And Ellen White does have a lot of insights, and I think you can learn a lot from reading her. You can learn a lot from reading the Bible, but I think you can learn even more discussing it with others. And so if you get a chance, someone reaches out to you and you get a chance to talk about the God you serve, it's a light in their life that may make a big difference. So let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this Sabbath. Thank you for this chance to discuss you and how you worked with others. Please help us to stay close to you and to be open to the opportunities we have to be a light to those in our family, our friends, in our communities, and hopefully someday be able to interact and see how others were a light to us and we were a light to them. In your name, amen. All right, happy Sabbath, everyone. Sam is usually the one to shut this off, but I think if we all just leave it.